Well, thanks to everyone who's helped put the service together, and particularly the musicians, both the ones here and A.T. Lauren, who sang earlier Songs of the Folk. A.T. lost his voice earlier this week, so he did quite well, and I'm about to lose mine, so I won't be long. But Whamageddon, if you wonder what's that got to do with anything, it's a family Christmas tradition that the Moore family have done for the last few years, is we play Whamageddon, and the rules, if you don't know it already, is it starts on the 1st of December, and you've got to get to Christmas Day without hearing the original of, Wham's version of Last Christmas. It requires a bit of honesty, and so if you hear it, you're out. And we've done this, it's about our 4th year doing it. I've always done it. This year I went out on the 3rd of December, and my wife Glad went out on the 4th of December. I went out through the BBC News, who played it in the news. They thought that was a good idea. Glad claimed to be asleep, and she heard it on YouTube or Facebook. She was watching silly videos about kittens, and they played Last Christmas. But there's a DJ played this at the Northampton. You might have seen this on the news. Northampton Football Club. DJ at half-time thought it'd be really funny to play Wham's Last Christmas, and he had 7,000 complaints. So because we're out now, we needed a new game. So a friend of mine, he's a Church of England vicar, and he posts a lot on Facebook. I don't know where he works, when he can work, because of what he does. So this is a game of Christmas bingo, or bar humbug mythbusters, as he calls it. And you get sometimes these in the news. You often get them in sermons around Christmas. And there are people who want to ruin our fun about what we think about Christmas. So they will tell you, it wasn't a star, it was a meteor. I don't know how they know. There were no animals. I think that's a bit dogmatic, so we'll see when we get there. Christmas trees are pagan. Actually, they're not. If you Google when you get home, St. Boniface, Christmas trees. Interesting, nice little story about Christmas. According to this, raisins are pagan. I've never heard that before. I thought raisins were fairly ecumenical. So great insult for someone, isn't it, you raisin-eating pagan. Angels didn't sing or have wings. I checked the bit that we just heard. It actually says they said, but it looks a bit like a song, doesn't it? So if you hear any of those, I'd like to be walking around Chelmsford or even past churches and hear people going, boo, humbug, because people have spoilt their Christmas with these things. Some of them are plain false, by the way. Jesus was not laid in a manger. We just heard he was. He wasn't born on the 25th of December. We'll come back to that. Then there's some rules. So, these are just spoil sports, aren't they? You just think, go away and be miserable by yourself and leave my Christmas alone. But they do have a point in a couple of places. The bits we associate with Christmas that are not in the Bible story. For example, Hugo read about the 3 kings. No, he didn't. Didn't say 3 kings. Magi from the east that had 3 gifts. Don't know how many they were. They weren't kings. There was no stable. Now, here's going to be a devastating news for some of you. There's no donkey. I've got some Bible software. I put in donkey into my Bible software. Interesting, 152 uses of the word donkey in the Bible, none of them in the Christmas narrative. Boo! Stop spoiling it. Now, why bother saying that? Well, the reason we celebrate Christmas is not just a collection of nice things, sort of a nice vibe, but we're celebrating an event that happened in history. And history is filled with interesting events. Some explain why we are the way we are now, why we have a democracy, why we speak English. But none of them lay a claim or demands on us day by day. But this, I think, does. And I've been struck by this a couple of times recently. So I was in a conversation recently with a man from another country. How do I know he's from another country? Because he was speaking to me on a train. So clearly not English. So he spoke to me, and he was a Muslim, and he was very interested to know what I thought, and he wanted to tell me what he thought. And he's very interested about what the two of us both think about Jesus. And he said, well, I guess because you're a Christian, you believe he rose from the dead. Well, I don't. I believe this, that, and the other. But we can't know, and so it doesn't matter. And I said, well, actually, I think the resurrection is good history. And I told him why I thought that, and he said, actually, that's pretty logical. That makes sense. I'm not going to talk about that now. You have to come back at Easter, funnily enough, for that. But there is a talk I've done on why I think the resurrection is good history on our YouTube channel. It's not probably the best talk about it, but it's my one, so you can get that on our channel. Most religions, it struck me, don't need to be historic, but Christianity does. So whether this or that happened, it doesn't matter in other worldviews, but Christianity just doesn't work. If it didn't happen, we just give up on it all. Another thing that struck me is there's a new cultural movement. I don't think it's got a name yet, but from time to time there are new cultural trends, and they tend to move society away from God and the church. But recently there's been a few public intellectuals that are embracing Christianity of various kinds. And the reason they're doing this is they're saying our culture is what they call a cut flower culture. So the church, through history, has got some shameful episodes, but pretty much everything you enjoy in our culture has its origins in Christianity. But our culture's cut off from that, so the flower is now dying. And there's lots of things that they say in our culture that's just being plain silly. And so they want to get back to where it comes from. But it struck me when I listened to these people or read them, they only go far back as the stem, not the root. It's okay what they're saying, but they don't go all the way back. They go to traditions and buildings and such like, but they don't go back to the very root. The root isn't ideas and culture and tradition and seeing the world differently. The root is Jesus. And that's what Luke tells us in the Luke chapter 2, the beginning of it that Ros just read to us. It says, the point Luke's making is this: it's good history, it's historic, it's an event, but it is a bit more than that. So 3 things he wants us to know, we're going to look at very quickly because my voice is going. He wants us to know when, where, and how, and not just for a bit of pub trivia, but each of those, where, when, and how, impacts us on a personal level. So, when? Luke wants us to see that this happened at a specific time. On one day, this happened. The 25th of December. Possibly. Maybe not. But if you go through Luke chapter 1 and do the maths, the date Zechariah, the angel saw Zechariah when Elizabeth's pregnancies, Mary's pregnancies, you end up with Jesus being born probably around late December. So 25th will do me. A day or two out, I'll let church history off for. Now, in other thoughts about the world, about God, about religion, it just doesn't matter when things happen. But the start of Luke's gospel, he says this. He says, look, I've carefully researched all of this. I've looked into the evidence. I've interviewed eyewitnesses. And he puts in lots of detail. Sometimes Luke gives us more detail than we really need. And his point is this, very simply, it happened. And we can look into it and testify this happened. He's saying very specifically, it happened at the time when there's a census, when Caesar Augustus was emperor of Rome. Now, I didn't know whether to mention this, but I thought someone's going to be a smart aleck in the room and say, I saw a programme on Channel 4, or I read an article in the newspaper, and says there's a problem with Luke. And here's the problem. Luke says this happened during the census when Quirinius was governor in Syria. And we know from Josephus that was 6 AD. But also we're told that Jesus is born when Herod the Great was king. That would be 4 BC, before Quirinius was governor. And so people then go, aha, Luke is wrong. Actually, no one raises that as a problem for the last probably decade. Because here historians have resolved, and non-Christian historians as well, have resolved that problem. There's a number of issues going around, but generally what's happened over the years is when people think that something in Luke is wrong, or in the Bible is wrong, a bit later, more we find shows that they were right all along. As time goes on, we see the Bible is more accurate than we did before, rather than less. But if you're paying attention, the bit Ross says it was the first registration. And the Greek word, although we like our traditions, so we always say governor, the word there isn't governor, but something like a senior civil servant. So Luke's saying, you know that famous census during Augustus, the one before that? And actually, there are many of these censuses between 10 BC, 20 AD. We've got Augustus' writing, and he has all this data that he collected from these censuses he had at the time he was emperor. Now, so Luke's first readers know exactly what Luke meant. Now, we can put a stab on it around about 4 BC, but probably 25th of December. But they would have known exactly the day he meant. So Luke is talking not about an idea, but he's talking about a moment, a date and a time. He's talking about historic fact. But also what Luke does, he loves it, he does this, especially in the early chapters, is he does contrasts. He tries to make us see things in their extremes. So he says, you've got Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, who claims to be king of the world and calls himself the Son of God, which actually is what Luke and the rest of the Bible claim about Jesus. And so right from the start, he raises this question, well, who do you think is the king of the world and the Son of God? Well, why do you think early Christians were fed to lions? It's because they said, well, Caesar isn't king, Jesus is king. Caesar is middle management. That's why Christians still get persecuted around the world today, because people say, well, I'm the boss of this country, and Christians go, well, it makes you feel better, but I mean, there's someone who's over the world. Jesus claims to be king and claims to be king today. So Christianity is not just a way of seeing the world or a way to help us understand the way the world is, although it does that. It's not a way to live, although it is that. But it's about reality. It's about what is real. Something, someone really happened. And it's not just an interesting fact, but it has an ongoing effect, which we'll think about in a second. Where? Tied to time is a place. It happened in a specific place. And Google Maps shows how far these people walked. Mary and Joseph were from Nazareth. But this decree from Augustus meant they had to walk to Bethlehem. And you can see it's a fair trek. Now, because of the news we have at the moment, we're familiar with this part of the world. About 28,000 people live in Bethlehem. At the time this happened, about 2,000. Earlier in the service, right near the beginning, Lynn read from Micah 5, written about 500 years before Jesus was born. And he's a prophet, and that means God speaks through him and speaks about the future. And there's a promise that there'll be a ruler, a king, and a rescuer sent by God, and he will be born in Bethlehem. So we sort of clock that. God has promised a special person from Bethlehem. And then Luke repeatedly, to make sure we notice, calls it the city of David. And then he tells us that Joseph is in the line of David. David was a king of Israel, notable for a few things. He's about 1,000 years before Jesus. But God promised him there will always be a descendant of David as a king. And that one of these future kings is going to rule the world. All of the world will voluntarily come to his throne and make him their king. So Luke is telling us this. When did it happen? The same time as Caesar, who claims to rule the world. Where? Well, in the king town of Bethlehem. He's saying this one is born, is the promised one that's been talked about for hundreds of years. The one who's come to rule the world. So this census is outside of Mary and Joseph's control, but it pushes them to the right place at the right time. So notice Jesus is not born in the imperial city, in the imperial capital. He's not in a place that's viewed by the people as important, but in an outlying province. In fact, it's part of Syria at that time. It doesn't even have its own province. An outlying small town. And yet it's the centre of God's plan. God doesn't always work in obvious places. He even works in Chelmsford. And the point Luke wants us to see is that God's plan and purpose is coming together. And that is that one will be born in Bethlehem, Jesus, to save and to rule the world. But that claim then it means that he rules over you as well. Now, how does he come? How did he come? What manner did he come? Now, how Jesus is born isn't just interesting. It tells us about the very nature of God and what Christ would be like for the rest of his life and his death. Luke is the longest of the four Gospels. He gives us loads of detail about all sorts of things apart from his birth. He's very light on detail. So we get lots about angels singing and either side of it, but when it comes to the birth, he went and he's born and doesn't tell us much more. So there's a contrast again at the start of the reading, starts in a palace and ends in a manger, an animal feeding trough. So you have grandeur and then poverty. So another humbug moment for you. There wasn't a stable. And I don't think there was an inn either. The word is stuck in our imagination, but the Greek word is usually translated for the upper or the spare room, and hence why I did this picture. So this is what a first century house would have looked like in Israel back in the day. You sleep upstairs in a sort of a half floor, and guests, if you had any guests, they would squeeze in there, or they'd sleep on the roof. They have better weather than we do. And because everyone's got to go back to their ancestral home, the bit that Ros read, the last reading, there is no room left. And so they'd go in the guest room space, and it doesn't say stable, it says manger. So we infer that that's where the animals live. We assume some kind of outhouse. But what it means is the downstairs living area where animals are brought in at night. Rather than the idea in our mind, we've sort of got this first century idea of they went to the Premier Inn and there's no room, so they slept in the garage. That's not what happened. Which ruins one of my earliest memories of being an innkeeper in the school nativity play, singing, which I won't do now, about there being no room. Now, imagine this. I've got some of my family here, some of my extended family here, and if we all had to register to pay taxes as they did then, so we all had to go back to one of our ancestral homes, and we stayed at my granddad's house in Dagenham, 2 up, 2 down. It would be cosy, to say the least. Now, I used to live in Merseyside. I used to live by Tranmere Rovers football ground, and on the other side of the hill, it's Lower Tranmere, by Birkenhead Station, there's an area that the old people called Donkey Town. So there's more to do with donkeys in Tranmere than the Bible narrative. But when what you get in this area of Tranmere was 2 up, 1 down, and an outside loo. And it's called Donkey Town because people kept their donkeys in the living room. Because they would take their donkey in the morning to the station, load it up, and then take the goods wherever it needs to go in the Wirral. So this isn't that far out. This is how people used to live, and some parts of the world still do. So now you've got a picture in your mind of what that first Christmas is like and what's going on. It doesn't change what we believe about God. So why did I bother spoiling 10 to 20% of Christmas cards by saying there wasn't a stable? One of the names given to the child born at Christmas is Emmanuel. It means God with us. Jesus is God come into the world as one of us. He was ordinary. In fact, he is under ordinary. He was poor. There was not enough room. Now that's very striking, but also it's significant because either side of the bit that Ros read to us, Luke gives these dramatic accounts of angels appearing in the sky, and they're glorious as they speak and sing of this child. And they bring together all these promises from the Old Testament for hundreds of years about God coming into the world as a mighty king to rule, and yet he comes as a baby, squeezed into the bit of space there is, using a food trough for animals as a makeshift cot. Not a palace in comfort. So the explanations around him is all glorious. The sight is mundane and poor. And that's striking because this is the pattern of Christ's life and death. And this is the nature of God. It shows that God is concerned about the lonely and the rejected and the marginalised. And God's concerned about you. And he comes alongside them. And he still does. Again, Luke gives us his contrasts. Mary first found that she's expecting, and she sang of God raising up the low and bringing down the high. You've got Augustus in his palace thinking much of himself, as emperors did. But the real king, the eternal God, the king of the universe, the one who's actually worthy of praise, the one that's actually entitled to things, he became nothing. You would hardly have noticed him. If God came down and lived in a palace, that would be him lowering himself. And this pattern he continued through his life up to his death, where he allowed himself to be subject to a kangaroo court and died the death of a criminal in pain on a cross. And Matthew and Luke, where we get most of our knowledge of the Christmas story from, they both drop clues in all the way. As they start to talk about his birth, they talk about the reason why he came. He came to go to the cross and to die. Even his name that's given at the beginning of the Gospels, Jesus, means the Lord saves. And when you think, well, from what? The angel carries on to save his people from their sins. We just sung Hark the Herald, and it used this line, veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. God's glory and power were hid behind the weak flesh of Jesus. And this is where Christmas bites for us. We saw a little snippet a minute ago where I went round, Ben was filming, I went round and asked people, what does Christmas mean for you? I think for a moment, as you have your mince pies and things and drive home, think, what does Christmas mean for you? Now, the first two people were actually an ITV filming crew, and that's why they had the expensive equipment. And they were going around Chelmsford asking, what does Christmas mean to you? So imagine their surprise when they met two ministers. And they asked us for a Christmas cracker joke as well. And I dried up and they fed me one. And they asked Ben for a Christmas cracker joke, and he said, I'm from South Carolina, I don't know what a Christmas cracker is. But they were asking people, and we asked them the same questions. What does Christmas mean for you? And the answer mostly people give is family, connection, and presence. We long for connection. And often we feel distant. Relationships are broken or strained, and especially they're broken by death. But I suggest that's the tip of the iceberg. The issue is connection with God. That's what you actually yearn for. And all other connections derive from. But that is broken and leads to death. And from that brokenness, all relationships are strained at best. And there's sort of not a polite English way of doing this. There's an awkwardness of talking about what the Bible speaks about, what the Christmas story speaks about sin. The angel said to Mary, you're pregnant with this son, you're going to call Jesus to save his people from their sin. Jesus came in weakness so that he could go to the cross and die so that we can be forgiven. Jesus lived as an ordinary person who experienced all the sort of things that we do apart from sin. And at that moment on the cross, he took our sin and it was considered as his. He took the blame for our sin and all the consequences of our wrongdoing. That is our rejecting of the King of the universe. And he reconnects us with God the Father. And then from that, with everyone else. Now, how do we know God exists? Well, Luke makes a big thing of it being history. How do you know that God exists? You can't see him. How do we know what he is like? It strikes me, most people I speak to want there to be a God, but they like to keep him vague and undemanding. But what Luke does is says there's a point in time. I can't show you God tonight as such. But if I had a time machine, I could introduce you to him. God had a postcode and an address. a specific time and place where you could have met him. What is he like? Well, Emmanuel, Jesus, is God with us, and you can still meet with him today. Mighty God came in weakness for the weak and the ordinary who live in obscure places. So just from those few verses in Luke, maybe I've raised more questions than you came to start with. In the new year, we run a Christianity Explored course, usually on Wednesday evenings, about 7 in the evening. Happens in Ben's house. Of course, we've got our services that I mentioned earlier. You might want to find out a bit more from the questions that have been raised. You may want to take some action now. This is a historic event that happened that we remember, but it's actually significant to us today. Talk to God about it. Let us know if you do. I always find that interesting. That's what prayer means. It's just speaking to God and ask for forgiveness that's offered in Jesus and make Jesus your King. The last verse, we're going to sing another carol in a second. The last verse has these lines in it. Cast out our sin and enter in, be born in us today. That's what the word Jesus means. The Lord saves. And he goes on to say, come to us, abide with us, our Lord Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us.